Hey everyone. Some stories were never meant to be silenced. Tonight we step into a world where being a priest was a death sentence, where prayer had to be whispered and faith itself became a crime. So find a quiet place, turn off the lights and close your eyes. If you enjoy these calm journeys through the past, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps keep these stories alive. And let me know what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. It's amazing how many of us gather here to remember history together. Before the great unraveling, time itself was consecrated. It did not simply pass. It unfolded according to a rhythm measured not in secular hours, but in the sacred cadences of the Orthodox Church. For centuries, across the vast, snow-swept expanse of the Russian land, from the polished floors of St. Petersburg to the humblest izba in a Siberian village, life was woven from the threads of the liturgical calendar. The year began not in the dead of winter, but in the hopeful breath of spring with the Great Lent. It was a time of quietude and introspection. The rich, fatty foods of the Maslenitsa festival were put away, and a communal fast descended upon the people. The diet became spare: dark bread, pickled vegetables, mushrooms from the forest, but the spirit was meant to be nourished. The bells of the local church, which usually rang with a full-throated joy, now tolled with a somber, measured grief, calling the faithful to long, prostrating services. It was a shared, collective preparation for the resurrection, a season of emptying oneself to be filled with grace. Then came Pascha, Easter, the Feast of Feasts. The world, held in the grey stillness of Lent, exploded into light and sound. In the deep of night, processions would wind their way around churches, candles flickering like a river of stars in the darkness. At the stroke of midnight, the doors would be thrown open, and the priest, robed in brilliant white and gold, would proclaim the words that shattered the winter of the soul: Christos Voskrese, Christ is risen. The response would come back from the throng, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. Voistinu Voskrese, truly he is risen. The long fast was broken with kulich and painted eggs, and for days the bells would ring without ceasing, their jubilant peals rolling across the fields and forests, announcing that life had triumphed over death. Summer brought the green feast of Pentecost, when churches were decorated with birch branches, their floors carpeted in fresh-cut grass, the very air thick with the scent of new life. The harvest was blessed in late summer, the first fruits of the earth offered in thanks. Autumn was for remembrance, for prayers for the departed, and the cycle would turn again towards the quiet anticipation of the Nativity, the world holding its breath for the birth of the divine. This was not an abstract theology. It was the air people breathed. Faith was tangible. It lived in the Krasny Ugol, the beautiful corner of every home, where icons of Christ, the Theotokos, and the family's patron saints looked down with serene, knowing eyes. A small lamp, the lampada, was kept burning before them, its tiny flame a constant, silent prayer. A person entering a home would first cross themselves towards the icons before greeting their hosts. Every significant moment of life was sanctified: the baptism that brought a new soul into the community of Christ, the wedding that crowned a man and woman as king and queen of their own small domestic church, the funeral that commended a soul to God's mercy with the scent of incense and the sound of ancient chants. The village church, often the only stone building for miles, was the axis around which everything turned. Its golden or sky-blue dome was the first thing a traveler saw, a beacon of home and heaven. Its bells were the voice of the community, marking the hours, calling to prayer, warning of fire or invasion, tolling for the dead, and celebrating the saved. To live in that world was to be perpetually aware of a reality that lay just beyond the visible, a sacred dimension interwoven with the fabric of the everyday. Then, in 1917, the rhythm broke. The metronome of centuries was shattered overnight. It was not a gradual cooling of faith, but a cataclysm, a geological shift in the spiritual landscape. The new power that seized the state arrived with its own creed, its own saints, and its own eschatology. It was a faith of a different kind, a faith in reason, in progress, in the material world as the sole reality. In this new gospel, the old one was not merely incorrect. It was a poison. Religion was declared the opiate of the masses, a tool of oppression designed to keep the populace docile, with promises of a spectral afterlife. The church, which had been the soul of the nation, was now its enemy, a relic of a dark, superstitious past that had to be systematically dismantled for the bright future to be born. The change began with sound, or rather, the absence of it. An order was given, and the bells fell silent. For the first time in memory, the mornings were not greeted by their call to matins, nor the evenings settled by their summons to vespers. The sonic landscape of Russia was muted, a profound and unnerving stillness settling over cities and villages alike. The voice of God as many had known it was gagged. Soon the bells themselves were taken down, not with reverence but with brute force. Hauled from their towers to be melted down for the needs of industry, their sacred purpose transmuted into the profane material of the new age. Then came the assault on sight. The icons, those windows into heaven, were the next to go. They were removed from schools, hospitals, and public offices. Party activists went from house to house explaining, cajoling, and eventually demanding that the Krasny Ugol be dismantled. Families were told that these painted boards were symbols of ignorance, holding back their children from a scientific understanding of the world. And so, with trembling hands, people took them down. Some were surrendered, ending up in anti-religious museums where they were displayed as objects of folk art or primitive superstition. Others were burned in public bonfires, the serene faces of the saints curling and blackening in the flames. The churches themselves, the physical hearts of their communities, were closed. The statistics were stark and brutal. Tens of thousands of churches and monasteries were shuttered. Their crosses were torn from their domes, their sacred vessels confiscated, their vestments repurposed. Some became warehouses, their sacred spaces filled with sacks of grain. Others were turned into cinemas, workers' clubs, or sports halls, the echoes of the divine liturgy, replaced by political speeches or the thud of a volleyball. The most prominent cathedrals were converted into museums of atheism, where the story of faith was retold as a history of deception and exploitation. The altar, once the site of the Holy Eucharist, now held displays debunking miracles and exposing holy relics as fraudulent. The shepherds of the flock were scattered. Priests, monks, and nuns were arrested by the thousands. They were branded as counter-revolutionaries, as parasites on the working class. Their absence created a vacuum of spiritual guidance. There was no one to baptize the newborn, to marry the young, or to bury the dead with the ancient rites that had given meaning to these passages for generations. Yet, a creed enforced by the state cannot so easily extinguish a faith that lives in the heart. While the outward forms of religion were being systematically destroyed, its essence retreated inward, into a hidden, silent world. The grand, communal expression of faith was atomized into millions of individual acts of quiet defiance. The prayers did not stop. They were merely whispered. In the dead of night, in the privacy of a small room, a mother might trace the sign of the cross over her sleeping child. An old man walking to work might murmur the Jesus prayer under his breath. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. A continuous, internal litany that the noise of the new world could not drown out. The icons that were not surrendered were hidden. They were tucked away in the backs of wardrobes, placed inside chests under layers of linen, or slid beneath loose floorboards. In the darkness, when the family was alone and the curtains were drawn, an icon might be brought out. A small candle, bought on the black market or saved from before, would be lit. For a few precious moments, the Krasny Ugol would be reconstituted, a fleeting secret sanctuary. The family would stand before it, not daring to chant, but moving their lips to the words of psalms learned in childhood, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. The grandmothers, the babushki, became the guardians of the faith. They were the living repositories of a world that was officially ceasing to exist. Having seen the old reality, they refused to fully accept the new one. In hushed tones, they would tell their grandchildren the stories of the saints, the parables from the Gospels, and the meaning of the great feasts. They would teach them the Lord's Prayer, line by line, a secret inheritance passed from one generation to the next, in defiance of the state's catechism. The great rituals of life continued in the shadows. A priest, living without documents and moving from village to village, might perform a baptism at night in a remote cottage, using a simple basin of water. Couples might seek out a secret wedding, their union blessed not in a gilded church, but in a forest clearing. Easter, the heart of the Orthodox year, was not erased. There were no public proclamations, no all-night vigils, no bells. But in countless homes, the fast was still kept. The public square was filled with the loud, vibrant ideology of the state. There were parades with red banners, posters of new leaders who promised a paradise on earth, and lectures on the virtues of scientific materialism. It was a world of certainty, of bold pronouncements of a future being built with concrete and steel. But beneath this surface, another world persisted. It was a world of silence, of memory, of flickering candles in hidden corners. It was a faith stripped of its external grandeur, its cathedrals, its bells, its public ceremony. What remained was its core, a personal, often perilous relationship with the divine. The attempt to extinguish belief had for many refined it. It became a conscious choice rather than a cultural inheritance. To believe was to risk, and in that risk faith found a new, somber and unbreakable strength. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, caught in the quiet tension between the visible empire of disbelief and the invisible kingdom that endured, silent and deep, in the hearts of its people. The decade that followed the storms of revolution and civil war was not one of peace, but of a different, quieter kind of conflict. The sound of artillery had faded, replaced by the relentless grinding of a new ideological machine. For religion in the nascent Soviet Union, the 1920s were a descent into a long twilight, a period of sustained, calculated pressure designed to unmake centuries of belief. The overt violence of the Red Terror had subsided, yet the war against faith had merely changed its form, becoming more systematic, more pervasive, and in many ways, more insidious. The new state, built on the bedrock of dialectical materialism, viewed religion not merely as an error, but as a hostile force, the opiate of the masses that dulled the revolutionary consciousness. The 1918 decree on the separation of church and state from the school had been the opening salvo, stripping the Orthodox Church of its legal status, its property, and its role in public life. What had once been an empire's spiritual pillar was now a tenant on its own land, subject to the whims of a government that saw its very existence as a threat. By the early 1920s, this legal framework was being ruthlessly implemented. The campaign to confiscate church valuables, ostensibly to combat the devastating famine of 1921-22, served a dual purpose. It provided the state with much-needed resources, but more importantly, it was a profound act of psychological warfare. Believers watched in horror as sacred vessels, chalices, and icon coverings, objects consecrated by generations of prayer, were melted down. The act was a deliberate desacralization, a public demonstration that the material world, governed by the state, held ultimate power over the spiritual. Priests and parishioners who resisted were arrested, tried, and in some cases executed. The message was unambiguous. Loyalty to God was treason against the people's state. Amidst this assault, the landscape of faith fractured. It did not vanish, but rather split into two parallel realities: the visible and the invisible, the sanctioned and the secret. One path was that of official, registered existence. A religious community, be it Orthodox, Muslim, Jewish, or Baptist, could continue to function only by navigating a labyrinth of state controls. To exist officially, a parish had to be registered by a group of at least 20 laypeople, the Dvadsatka. This group became legally responsible for the church building, which was now state property leased back to them. They were accountable for taxes, repairs, and compliance with all Soviet laws. This created an immediate and crushing burden. The taxes levied on clergy and church properties were punitive, often far exceeding those on secular organizations. The state could, and frequently did, deny permits for essential repairs, allowing historic structures to decay into ruin, providing a pretext for their eventual closure. The clergy were disenfranchised, stripped of their voting rights, and classified as lishentsy, deprived ones, a status that also affected their families, barring their children from higher education and certain professions. Within these officially sanctioned churches, faith breathed a shallow, monitored air. Services were permitted, but their content was scrutinized. Sermons could not touch upon politics or the state's anti-religious campaigns. Any charitable or educational activity was strictly forbidden. The church was to be a place of ritual only, disconnected from the community's social fabric. State security agents, both overt and covert, often attended services, their presence a silent reminder of the precariousness of this tolerated worship. This policy of control was refined through the state-supported schism within the Orthodox Church itself. The Living Church, or Renovationist movement, emerged with the Kremlin's tacit and sometimes open support. Renovationist leaders were willing to collaborate, to declare loyalty to the Soviet regime, and to condemn the counter-revolutionary elements of the traditional patriarchal church. They accommodated the new order, hoping to preserve a form of orthodoxy by sacrificing its political independence. For a time, the state granted them control over many prominent cathedrals, seeking to divide and conquer the faithful. Many believers, however, saw the living church as a compromised, soulless entity, a hollow shell created by an atheist state. They clung to the patriarchal church, loyal to Patriarch Tikhon, even as he was placed under house arrest and the institution he led was systematically dismantled. For these believers, attending a registered church was an act of quiet defiance, but it was a defiance performed on the enemy's terms. The tolling of a church bell was a victory, but it was a victory permitted by the very power that sought its ultimate silence. This was faith under surveillance, a public performance of piety in a theater of oppression. But beyond the reach of the state's watchful eye, another form of faith was taking root. This was the second path, the descent into the catacombs. As official churches were closed, turned into granaries, workers' clubs, cinemas, or museums of atheism, belief did not evaporate. It flowed into hidden channels, becoming private, portable, and clandestine. This was the catacomb church, a term that evoked the early Christians hiding from Roman persecution. It was not a single organized body, but a vast, scattered network of believers bound by a shared refusal to submit. Worship moved from the gilded dome to the cramped apartment, from the stone cathedral to the forest clearing. In cities, small groups would gather in a believer's flat. A corner would be arranged with a hidden icon, a few candles lit. The liturgy, stripped of its magnificent choir and incense-filled ceremony, was whispered. The Eucharist was consecrated on a simple table. The risk was immense. A neighbor's suspicion, a careless word, could lead to the arrest of the entire congregation and the priest who served them. In rural areas, services took place in remote farmhouses or deep within the woods. Priests, often defrocked and living without documents, wandered the countryside, moving from village to village under the cover of darkness. They performed secret baptisms, weddings, and funerals, sustaining the sacramental life of communities whose churches had been shuttered. These were the true spiritual shepherds, risking their freedom and their lives to minister to a scattered flock. Their vestments were not silk and gold, but the worn clothes of a peasant or laborer. Their authority came not from any state-sanctioned body, but from the desperate faith of the people who sheltered them. The home became the ultimate sanctuary. The Krasny Ugel, the beautiful corner where the family icon traditionally hung, did not disappear. The icon was simply hidden. It might be placed in a chest or concealed behind a portrait of Lenin or a state-produced poster, brought out only at night for furtive prayers. Grandmothers, the babushkas, became the primary keepers of the faith. While the state-run schools indoctrinated children with atheism, these women became the secret catechists. In hushed tones, they taught their grandchildren the Lord's Prayer, told them the stories of the saints, and explained the meaning of Easter and Christmas, holidays that were being systematically erased from the public calendar and replaced with Soviet celebrations. This domestic faith was one of silence and memory. It was a faith passed on not through theological treatises, but through the lighting of a candle, the taste of a blessed loaf of bread, the familiar cadence of a memorized prayer. It was an act of profound cultural and spiritual preservation, a quiet insistence that the world of the spirit was real, no matter how loudly the state proclaimed its non-existence. The state's anti-religious propaganda was relentless. The League of the Militant Godless, founded in 1925, published newspapers and journals filled with crude caricatures of priests and mockeries of dogma. Public debates were staged, where eloquent atheist orators would challenge barely educated village priests, turning theology into a spectacle of public humiliation. Holy relics were publicly exposed as frauds. The entire vocabulary of belief was targeted, reframed as superstition, ignorance, and the product of class exploitation. Yet, this very pressure forged a different kind of believer. For those who persisted, faith was no longer a matter of passive cultural inheritance. It became a conscious, deliberate choice made in the face of ridicule and risk. It required a deep, personal conviction that could withstand the state's monolithic certainty. The silence imposed by the regime forced believers inward. Deprived of public expression, faith became more introspective, more deeply rooted in the individual conscience. It was a faith tested not by theological debate, but by the daily threat of loss, the loss of a job, of social standing, of freedom itself. By the end of the 1920s, the religious landscape of the Soviet Union was unrecognizable from what it had been a decade earlier. The institutional power of the church was broken. Thousands of churches were closed, monasteries dissolved, and clergy imprisoned or exiled. Religion had been driven from the public square, its voice reduced to a whisper, but it had not been eradicated. It had adapted, transforming from a powerful institution into a resilient cellular network of belief. It survived in the compromised rituals of the registered churches, in the secret liturgies of the catacomb communities, and in the quiet prayers murmured in countless homes. It persisted in the courage of a priest who chose to serve an illegal parish, and in the stubborn memory of a grandmother who refused to let her grandchildren forget. The faith that endured the 1920s was a tempered one, stripped of its worldly power, but possessed of a silent, unyielding strength. It was a testament to the idea that a belief, when driven underground, can put down roots in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the human spirit, waiting with patient certainty for a distant, unimaginable spring. The year 1929 dawned under a Soviet sky, not with the warmth of spiritual awakening, but with the chilling pronouncement of ideological decree. The Bolshevik government, in its relentless pursuit of a classless society, had set its sights on one of the most deeply ingrained aspects of the human experience, faith. A new law, sweeping and comprehensive, declared all religious activity outside the strict purview of state control as illegal. This was not a quiet amendment, but a fundamental reshaping of public life, a deliberate severing of ancient roots that had for centuries nourished the soul of the land. The implications were immediate and profound. The state, now the sole arbiter of truth and social order, could not tolerate any competing locus of loyalty or belief. The divine, once a whispered comfort and a guiding star, was now relegated to the shadows, an inconvenient relic of a bygone era. The new law, enacted with a bureaucratic precision that belied its devastating consequences, effectively outlawed prayer groups in homes, scripture readings in clandestine corners, and the very act of public devotion that had characterized centuries of Russian life. The machinery of the state, already finely tuned to the requirements of the revolution, moved with an efficient if brutal purpose. Priests, the spiritual guides and conduits of faith for millions, became immediate targets. The charges leveled against them were often vague, couched in the language of counter-revolutionary activity, of undermining the new Soviet order, or of hoarding wealth, though many lived lives of extreme asceticism. Thousands, their vestments a stark contrast to the drab uniforms that now held sway, were arrested. These were men who had dedicated their lives to service, often to communities that were themselves impoverished and struggling. Their removal was not just a personal tragedy. It was the severing of a vital thread in the social fabric. The historic monasteries, bastions of centuries-old tradition, repositories of art and scripture, and centers of spiritual learning faced a similar fate. These were not merely buildings, they were living embodiments of faith, places where generations had sought solace, enlightenment, and connection to something greater than themselves. Under the new law, their autonomy was extinguished. Many were summarily closed, their ornate icons, their illuminated manuscripts, their centuries-old libraries deemed contraband of the ideological revolution. The silence that descended upon these once vibrant spaces was profound. Some were transformed into utilitarian structures, dormitories, warehouses, or even prisons themselves, a grim irony that mirrored the fate of those who had once inhabited them. The very stones of these ancient edifices bore witness to a profound cultural upheaval, their sacred spaces now occupied by the demands of the secular state. Religious gatherings, the communal expressions of faith that bound individuals together, were now strictly forbidden. The image of the faithful, huddled together in a dimly lit church, their voices rising in unison in prayer or hymns, became a dangerous anachronism. The vibrant pulse of religious life, which had once organized festivals, provided charity, and offered a framework for understanding existence, was systematically dismantled. The open squares that had once hosted religious processions, with their banners and icons held aloft, were now reserved for May Day parades and ideological rallies. The collective expression of faith, a powerful force for social cohesion and individual comfort, was fragmented, driven underground or extinguished altogether by the sheer weight of state prohibition. The emotional and cultural impact of these actions rippled through Soviet society like a chilling wind. For those who clung to their faith, it was a period of profound disorientation and loss. The familiar rituals, the comforting assurances of spiritual guidance, the sense of belonging to a community of believers, all were threatened, if not outright eradicated. The public sphere, once interwoven with religious observance, became sterile, devoid of the symbolic language that had for so long provided meaning and context. The absence of public worship meant that profound life events, births, marriages, deaths, were now stripped of their spiritual dimension, reduced to secular ceremonies overseen by the state. The comforting rites of passage, which had connected individuals to a lineage of faith and to the mysteries of existence, were replaced by bureaucratic procedures, leaving many feeling adrift in a sea of enforced secularism. The collective experience of these years is one of a deep, often unspoken sorrow. Families had to conceal their beliefs, teaching their children prayers in hushed tones behind closed doors, fearing denunciation. The very act of passing down religious traditions, once a natural and cherished part of family life, became an act of quiet defiance. The fear of being discovered, of the repercussions that followed such transgressions, cast a long shadow. This fear permeated everyday interactions, fostering a climate of suspicion and distrust, even within households. The communal solace found in shared belief was replaced by enforced isolation, the spiritual nourishment that had sustained generations now a forbidden fruit. This was a historical moment where ideology, rigid and unyielding, sought to supplant the fluidity and depth of spirituality. The Bolshevik project was not merely political or economic, it was deeply ideological, aiming to remold the very consciousness of its citizens. Religion, with its emphasis on the transcendent, on individual conscience, and on a moral framework that predated and existed outside the state, was seen as an obstacle to this totalizing vision. The state, in its ambition, believed it could provide all the answers, all the meaning that humanity required. It posited that science, reason, and the collective will of the proletariat, guided by the party, were sufficient to explain the universe and to direct human destiny. The narrative of this era is not one of grand pronouncements or dramatic confrontations, but of a slow, steady erosion. It is a story told in the quiet closing of church doors, in the anxious glances of those who dared to whisper a prayer, in the empty pews that marked the decline of communal worship. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, which, even in the face of overwhelming pressure, often found ways to preserve fragments of its spiritual inheritance. Yet it is also a somber reflection on the power of the state to reshape cultural landscapes, to impose its will on the deepest aspects of human experience, and to, for a time, dim the light of spiritual expression in the name of ideological purity. The events of 1929 were not an isolated incident, but a crucial chapter in a broader historical narrative of societal transformation, where the pursuit of a specific earthly utopia led to the suppression of a realm that had long offered solace and meaning beyond the material world. The legacy of this period is a complex one, marked by loss, but also by the enduring testament to the human need for something more, a persistent echo of faith in the face of an ideologically mandated silence. The law of 1929 had fallen like a portcullis, severing the visible life of faith from the body of the state. What followed was not a swift execution, but a slow, methodical strangulation. The years that unspooled into the 1930s were a time of profound and deliberate silence, an era defined not by the sound of prayers, but by the echoes of their absence. The campaign began with the physical shell of the church. Across the vast expanse of the Union, from the ancient stones of Kiev to the wooden spires of the north, a great dismantling was underway. It was a war waged on architecture and symbol. The domes that had caught the sun for centuries were stripped of their gold, their surfaces left to the dull corrosion of the elements. Crosses were pulled from their apexes, crashing to the earth with a final metallic groan. The most resonant act of this purge was the silencing of the bells. For generations, their call had marked the rhythm of life, the summons to worship, the tolling for the dead, the peal of celebration. Now they were declared instruments of counter-revolutionary noise. Workmen ascended the belfries, levers and ropes in hand, and the great bronze bells were tipped from their cradles. Their descent was brief and brutal. They fell, cracking on the cobblestones below or sinking into the mud, their resonant voices forever fractured. Thousands were hauled away to be melted down, their sacred function recast into the profane material of industry and armament. The interiors of the churches were subjected to an equally systematic violation. Icons, darkened by the smoke of 1,000 candles and the veneration of generations, were torn from the iconostases. They were piled in public squares for bonfires, their painted faces of Christ, the Theotokos and the saints blistering and turning to ash in the heat. Others were used for target practice or simply discarded in heaps. Vestments of silk and gold thread were repurposed as theatrical costumes or torn into cleaning rags. Chalices and patens, vessels of the Holy Mystery, were inventoried as precious metals and sent to state coffers. The buildings themselves were redesignated. A cathedral might become a granary, its cavernous nave filled with the dust of harvested wheat. A village church could be converted into a clubhouse for the young pioneers, its altar replaced by a stage for political lectures. Many simply became warehouses for agricultural machinery, the smell of incense replaced by the tang of oil and iron. This assault on the physical church was the prelude to the assault on its living body. The clergy, from the highest metropolitan to the humblest village priest and deacon, were systematically targeted. The accusations were formulaic, repeated in tribunals across the land. Anti-Soviet agitation, conspiracy, espionage, hoarding grain, resisting collectivization. Arrests were often made in the dead of night. A knock on the door, the brief appearance of state security agents, and a man would be gone, leaving behind a family and a flock now truly scattered. The trials, when they occurred, were public spectacles of humiliation, designed to strip the clergy of their spiritual authority before stripping them of their freedom. Their destinations were the burgeoning archipelago of labor camps. The Gulag, freight trains cramped and airless, carried them eastward and northward into the unforgiving landscapes of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic Circle. Among the most infamous of these destinations was the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea. There, one of the most revered and ancient monastic complexes in Russia was transformed into a prototype for the entire camp system. The thick stone walls built by monks for centuries of contemplative prayer now served to confine them. The cells that had housed ascetics became punishment blocks. The churches on the island, once centers of pilgrimage, were converted into workshops, mess halls, and barracks for prisoners. Within these camps, priests, monks, and bishops were indistinguishable from the other zeks, the political prisoners, the dispossessed kulaks, the common criminals. Their cassocks were replaced with quilted prison jackets. Their hands, accustomed to holding a gospel or offering a blessing, were calloused by the axe, the shovel, and the pick. They felled timber in the frozen taiga, dug canals in the Kazakh steppe, and mined coal in the Arctic north. Many did not survive their sentences. They succumbed to malnutrition, disease, exposure, or the casual brutality of the guards. Their deaths were unrecorded, their graves unmarked pits in the permafrost. A generation of spiritual leadership was effectively liquidated, leaving a profound void. With the institutions shattered and the clergy scattered, faith did not vanish. It retreated. It migrated from the public square to the private heart, from the cathedral to the corner of the room. This was the beginning of the underground church. A church without walls, without vestments, without bells. It was a church of whispers and memory. In the cramped confines of communal apartments and the quiet solitude of rural izbas, the life of prayer continued, shrouded in secrecy. The Krasny Ugol, the beautiful corner where the family icons had always hung, was often the last bastion. An icon might be hidden behind a curtain or a portrait of a state leader, taken down only for quiet prayer when neighbors were away or asleep. A flickering lampada, its small flame a pinprick of light in the darkness, could be a source of immense comfort, a fragile testament that not all light had been extinguished. The sacraments, the central rites of passage, became acts of quiet defiance. Baptisms were performed in secret, often by a grandmother or an elderly layperson if no priest could be found. A simple kitchen bowl held the water. The words of the rite were recited from a memorized prayer passed down through the family. Infants were baptized with a sense of urgency, a fear that the chain of faith stretching back a millennium might be broken with their generation. Weddings, too, went underground. A young couple, after the obligatory civil registration at a state office, might return home to stand before the family icon. Their parents would hold an icon over their heads, offering a silent blessing, a rite that carried more weight and sanctity for them than any state-sanctioned document. Funerals were perhaps the most poignant of these secret observances. Without a priest to chant the panikida, the memorial service, families would gather around the deceased and whisper psalms from memory. A small wooden cross might be surreptitiously slipped into the hands of the departed before the coffin was sealed. At the cemetery, where religious symbols were forbidden on graves, a mourner might discreetly trace the sign of the cross in the air over the freshly turned earth. A few priests and monks managed to evade arrest. They became wanderers, moving from village to village, from city to city, under the constant threat of discovery. They were the catacomb clergy. They traveled in secular clothes, carrying their sacred objects, a small gospel, a portable chalice, a packet of dried communion bread hidden in their belongings. They would celebrate the divine liturgy at night in a believer's home, with a simple table for an altar and a few trusted souls for a congregation. The news of such a priest's arrival would spread through a silent, invisible network of believers. His presence for a night or two was a profound event, a tangible link to the lost world of the open church, a reminder that the apostolic succession had not been entirely severed. The possession of religious items became a perilous act. A Bible, a prayer book, a brass cross, these were contraband. Pages from a gospel might be torn out and distributed among believers, each person memorizing their fragment of scripture. A cross was no longer worn visibly around the neck, but concealed beneath layers of clothing, its cold metal a secret comfort against the skin. These objects, humble and hidden, acquired a significance far beyond their material worth. They were relics of a faith under siege, physical anchors for a spiritual reality the state insisted did not exist. The darkest years of the 1930s, marked by the Great Purge, intensified this pressure. The climate of universal suspicion made any gathering, however small, a source of danger. A neighbor's careless word, a child's innocent remark at school, these could lead to a denunciation and an arrest. Faith became an exercise in radical trust and profound isolation. Believers learned to recognize one another not by open signs, but by a certain cast of the eye, a shared reticence, a common language of endurance. The outbreak of the Great Patriotic War in 1941 brought a strange and cynical reprieve. In a desperate bid to rally the nation against the German invasion, the state pragmatically relaxed its war on religion. The opiate of the masses was now seen as a potential source of patriotic fervor. The League of the Militant Godless was quietly disbanded. Some churches were allowed to reopen. A new Patriarch of Moscow was permitted to be elected in 1943 after years of the patriarchal throne remaining vacant. For a brief period, the sounds of liturgy and chant could once again be heard in a few city churches. Elderly priests were brought back from the camps, their bodies broken but their spirit intact, to serve the swelling congregations of soldiers praying for victory and mothers praying for their sons. This wartime thaw, however, was a strategic calculation, not a change of heart. It revealed the sheer resilience of the faith that had been presumed dead. The people who crowded into the newly opened churches had not forgotten how to pray. The rituals and hymns were still etched in their collective memory. The underground river of belief had surfaced, proving how powerfully it had continued to flow beneath the frozen ground of official atheism. After the war, the state's attitude hardened once more, though the methods of persecution became more bureaucratic and insidious. The mass arrests and executions of the 1930s were largely over, but control, co-option, and surveillance remained. The church was kept on a short leash, its activities strictly monitored. For many, especially in the countryside where local authorities continued the anti-religious campaigns with zeal, the life of secret prayer remained the only viable form of worship. The habits of concealment, ingrained over 2 decades, were not easily abandoned. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, this dual reality persisted: a small, heavily circumscribed official church and a vast, invisible network of personal faith. The generation that came of age during these years grew up in a world where belief was an intimate, familial secret. It was a truth whispered at the bedside, a gesture made in the privacy of one's own thoughts. Our hope nurtured in the face of overwhelming ideological pressure. The landscape bore the scars of the preceding decades. Ruined churches dotted the countryside, their bell towers silent, their roofs collapsed, their walls a canvas for revolutionary slogans. Monasteries remained state property, serving as museums, hospitals, or administrative buildings, their spiritual purpose a historical footnote in official guidebooks. And yet the faith they were built to house endured. It had been driven inward, transformed from a public spectacle into a quiet internal fire. It lived in the memory of a chanted psalm, in the feel of a hidden cross, in the shared glance of understanding between strangers. It was a testament, not to the power of institutions, but to the obstinate persistence of the human spirit to seek meaning beyond the material world, a quiet, unyielding light that no amount of darkness had been able to extinguish. The Soviet Union, forged in the crucible of revolution and ideologically committed to atheism, underwent a subtle, almost imperceptible transformation between the 1960s and the 1980s. The fervent anti-religious campaigns of earlier decades, which had sought to eradicate faith from the public sphere, began to soften. This was not a sudden capitulation, nor a wholesale embrace of spirituality. Rather, it was a gradual recalibration, a reluctant acknowledgement of an enduring human need that the state could not entirely extinguish. In the early years of the Soviet experiment, religion had been systematically dismantled. Churches, mosques, and synagogues were closed, repurposed, or demolished. Clergy were persecuted, and religious education was driven underground. The state actively promoted scientific materialism, presenting faith as a relic of a backward past, an opiate for the masses that hindered progress. Yet the seeds of belief once sown proved remarkably resilient. Even in the face of relentless pressure, individuals continued to hold fast to their spiritual convictions. As the decades wore on, the iron grip of ideological enforcement, while still strong, began to show faint fissures. The initial shockwaves of revolutionary zeal had subsided, and a new generation, born into the Soviet system, began to question the absolute pronouncements of the past. The state, grappling with internal challenges and a changing global landscape, found it increasingly difficult to maintain the total suppression of religious expression. It was during the Khrushchev thaw, and more significantly, during the Brezhnev era and the subsequent stagnation, that a quiet reappearance of religion became noticeable. This was not an open resurgence, but a series of concessions, often framed as pragmatic accommodations rather than ideological shifts. Some churches, long shuttered or neglected, were cautiously allowed to reopen, albeit under strict state supervision. These were often select edifices, chosen for their historical or architectural significance, or situated in areas where a certain level of public religious observance was deemed unavoidable. The state, through its various committees and monitoring bodies, maintained a vigilant watch over these officially sanctioned religious institutions. Every sermon was implicitly scrutinized, every appointment of clergy subject to approval. The activities of these churches were tightly controlled, their influence deliberately contained. They were permitted to function, but their role in society was to be minimal, their impact circumscribed to the private lives of their congregants. The aim was not to permit genuine religious freedom, but to manage and control an existing, albeit suppressed, phenomenon. For many believers, these reopened churches offered a lifeline. They provided a physical space for communal worship, a place to perform rituals, and a sense of continuity with tradition. The hushed interiors, often bearing the scars of past iconoclasm, could still resonate with the echoes of prayer and song. Services might be sparsely attended, the congregants aware of the watchful eyes, but the act of communal prayer itself was a powerful affirmation of faith. However, the reach of official tolerance was limited. Many religious buildings remained closed, their structures decaying or serving entirely secular purposes. For those who wished to practice their faith more openly or belong to denominations deemed less acceptable, the only recourse was to continue in private. This meant clandestine gatherings in apartments, homes transformed into makeshift chapels. Families would gather around icons, their voices low, their prayers whispered. These private congregations were characterized by a profound sense of shared commitment and a heightened awareness of risk. The act of gathering for worship in a private home was an act of quiet defiance. It required a deep trust between individuals, a willingness to expose oneself to potential repercussions. The furnishings of everyday life, the worn rug, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of the street, formed the backdrop to sacred rituals. The aroma of incense, if it could be obtained, would mingle with the scent of cooking. These were intimate spaces where faith was nurtured in secrecy, where the spiritual life found a way to persist, unburdened by the official gaze. The relationship between faith and ideology in the Soviet Union was a complex dance of suppression and adaptation. Communism as an ideology posited a materialist worldview, where all phenomena could be explained through scientific and economic principles. Religion, with its tenets of the supernatural, the divine, and the afterlife, was fundamentally at odds with this framework. The state sought to actively dismantle religious institutions and replace them with secular rituals and institutions that reinforced communist ideology. Yet, faith proved to be a more enduring force than the ideology anticipated. It offered solace in a world often marked by hardship, provided a moral compass, and connected individuals to a heritage that stretched back centuries. Even as the state promoted atheism, it could not erase the deeply ingrained cultural and historical roles that religion had played. The spiritual life that adapted to survive within the Soviet system was characterized by its resilience and its ingenuity. It found ways to express itself through subtle acts, through coded language, and through the nurturing of intergenerational transmission of beliefs. The passing down of religious knowledge from parents to children, often through oral tradition, and the discreet sharing of forbidden texts, became a vital mechanism for survival. In the privacy of their homes, believers engaged in practices that kept their faith alive. The reading of sacred texts, the observance of religious holidays, the private prayers, these were the quiet acts that sustained spiritual life. Icons hidden away in drawers or behind photographs held a potent symbolism. They were not just images, but portals to a spiritual realm that the official ideology denied. The children of these families, growing up in this bifurcated reality, learned to navigate a complex world. They understood that there were two narratives. The public one, dictated by the state, and the private one, lived within the family and the community of believers. This often fostered a critical awareness, a discernment between the pronouncements of authority and the truths held in the heart. The scarcity of religious materials, Bibles, prayer books, religious art, made their possession even more precious. These were not commodities to be bought and sold, but treasures to be guarded, shared carefully and passed on. Services in private homes, where they might exist, were often marked by a profound sense of community precisely because of their shared risk and their collective yearning for spiritual connection. The state's approach, while never truly liberal, evolved. The overt persecution of earlier decades gave way to a more nuanced strategy of containment and control. This created a space, however narrow, for religious practice to continue, albeit in a diminished and carefully managed form. The officially sanctioned churches, while operating under a long leash, provided a visible, albeit constrained, affirmation of religious existence. The private sphere, meanwhile, became a crucible for the enduring power of faith. It was in the quiet of homes, in whispered prayers and hidden icons, that the spiritual life of the Soviet Union found its most profound expression. This was not a loud rebellion, but a persistent hum, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to seek meaning and connection beyond the material and the ideological. As the 1980s approached, the cracks in the Soviet system began to widen. The ideological edifice, though formidable, was showing signs of strain. The quiet persistence of religious life, hidden from public view for so long, was a testament to the fact that faith, even when suppressed, does not disappear. It adapts, it endures, and in its own quiet way it waits. The gradual reappearance of religion in public life during this period was a complex phenomenon, born out of necessity and pragmatism rather than a genuine embrace of religious freedom. The state, facing the inherent limitations of its atheistic ideology and the persistent human need for spiritual expression, began to make calculated allowances. Some churches, once symbols of a suppressed faith, were allowed to reopen, their bells ringing with a muted resonance under the watchful eye of the authorities. These officially recognized religious institutions were carefully monitored. Their sermons were subject to implicit scrutiny, their leaders vetted by the state. The intention was not to foster vibrant religious communities, but to manage and contain religious observance, to limit its influence to the private sphere, and ensure it posed no threat to the ideological order. This managed coexistence allowed for a degree of public practice, a visible albeit constrained expression of faith for those who chose to avail themselves of it. For many, however, these concessions were insufficient or inaccessible. Denominations, deemed less palatable, or individuals seeking a more profound and unfettered spiritual life, continued to practice their faith in the shadows. Homes became sanctuaries, apartment living rooms transformed into clandestine chapels. Here, in the intimacy of shared belief, rituals were observed, prayers were offered, and the continuity of tradition was maintained. The landscape of faith in the Soviet Union during these decades was thus a dual one: the officially sanctioned, carefully managed public face of religion, and the deeply personal, often risky, private devotion. This duality reflected the ongoing tension between the state's ideological imperatives and the enduring human search for meaning beyond the material world. The adaptation of spiritual life within a system designed to suppress it revealed the profound resilience of faith. It found expression in subtle gestures, in the careful transmission of beliefs from one generation to the next, and in the creation of private networks of support and shared conviction. The scarcity of religious literature only heightened their value, making each shared Bible or prayer book a precious artifact. The quiet persistence of religious life, whether in the hushed tones of an officially sanctioned service or the whispered prayers within a private home, served as a counterpoint to the dominant ideology. It represented a space where the individual could connect with something larger than the state, a realm of personal meaning and spiritual transcending the confines of the material and the political. This was the enduring legacy of faith in the twilight years of the Soviet Union, a testament to its adaptability, its resilience, and its quiet, persistent presence in the human heart. In the final fading light of 1991, an empire exhaled its last cold breath. The vast and monolithic Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a structure that for more than 70 years had defined the horizon for millions, did not fall with the roar of a collapsing mountain. It crumbled quietly, like ice breaking on a river in an early, uncertain spring. The red flag, with its stark hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, descending into a history that felt both immense and suddenly distant. The air that followed was not filled with celebration, but with a profound and heavy silence, the silence of a great weight being lifted, leaving behind only the ghost of its pressure. For 3 generations, this silence had been an elemental force. It had seeped into the stone of the cities and the dark soil of the countryside. It was a silence not of peace, but of absence. The deepest of these absences was the sound of God. Churches, with their star-dusted domes and soaring spires, had been hollowed out, their sacred purposes erased. They became warehouses where sacks of grain were stacked against faded frescoes of the saints. They were converted into municipal swimming pools, the echoes of children's laughter mocking the vaulted ceilings that were built for psalms. Some became museums of atheism, where icons were displayed as artifacts of a primitive, superstitious past, their gilded surfaces dimmed under sterile lighting. The most profound silence, however, came from the bell towers. For centuries, the ringing of bells had been the heartbeat of the land, marking the hours, the holy days, the moments of communal sorrow and joy. Under Soviet rule, that heartbeat was stilled. Bells were torn down, their bronze bodies melted to forge the instruments of a new secular age. The air, once thick with their resonant calls to prayer, grew thin and empty. To have faith was to live within this enforced quiet, to cultivate an interior world where prayer was a whisper, a thought, a glance toward a hidden icon. It was a faith of hidden things. In the stillness that followed the Union's dissolution, something began to stir. It was not a movement, not a revolution, but a collective turning, as if a populace, hunched for decades against a bitter wind, was slowly straightening its back. The first sounds were tentative, the rasp of a key in a rusted lock that had not been turned since the 1920s, the groan of massive iron-strapped doors swinging inward, disturbing the dust of 70 years. Light, for the first time in generations, fell upon floors littered with industrial debris, upon walls where the pale, ghostly outlines of saints could be seen beneath layers of institutional paint. The work of reclamation was slow and deliberate. It was a quiet archaeology of the soul. People came at first in small groups, then in crowds, to clear the wreckage from their desecrated holy places. They scraped away the whitewash and plaster, and with each flake that fell away, a piece of heaven was restored. The sorrowful eyes of the Theotokos, the stern brow of John the Baptist, the serene golden halo of Christ Pantocrator. The air, thick with the smell of damp stone and decay, began to mingle with the scent of beeswax and old incense. A dormant fragrance reawakened, and then the bells returned. Some were discovered in forgotten storage, their surfaces tarnished, but their voices intact. Others were newly cast, the molten bronze poured into fresh molds with prayers and ceremony. When the first bell was raised into a refurbished tower and its clapper struck the metal lip, the sound that emerged was hesitant, almost shy, but it carried across the rooftops, a single pure note in the vast quiet. Then another bell answered from a different church, and another, until a chorus of bronze voices began to stitch the sky back together with sound. People stopped in the streets, their faces turned upward, listening. It was a sound their grandparents had known, a sound they themselves had only read about in forbidden books. It was the sound of a long-held breath being released. From the quiet margins of society, the keepers of this faith emerged. They were old men, their faces mapped with the lines of hardship and patience. For decades, they had been the secret priests, the shepherds of a flock that could not be seen. They had lived lives of profound duality. By day, they might have been bookkeepers, factory workers, or librarians, unremarkable figures in a collectivist state, but by night, or in the deep privacy of a crowded apartment, they became conduits to the divine. Their vestments were not of gold thread and silk, but of simple cloth, sewn by hand and hidden at the bottom of a trunk beneath worn linens. Their chalices were not silver, but sometimes simple glass. They had buried precious, centuries-old icons beneath the floorboards of their homes, wrapping them in oilcloth to protect them from the damp earth. They had celebrated the divine liturgy in whispers, the sacred words of John Chrysostom, a murmur against the ever-present fear of a neighbor's ear, a knock on the door. They baptized infants in kitchen sinks, the holy water mingling with the mundane. A confession might be heard on a park bench, the words of absolution lost in the rustle of leaves. Now these men stood in the open air, blinking in the unfamiliar light of legitimacy. Their backs were stooped, their hands trembled with age, but when they raised them to bless the crowds gathered before the reopened churches, they did so with an authority that had been forged in persecution, not granted by it. Their voices, when they intoned the first public liturgies, were not strong in the way of youth, but they possessed a different kind of strength, the resonance of a faith that had been tested by silence and had not been broken. They put on their hidden vestments, now creased and faded, and they looked like kings. For the first time in their lives, they did not have to look over their shoulders as they prayed. The act of confession, once an intimate and dangerous whisper, returned as a public sacrament. People formed lines waiting to unburden themselves of not only personal sins, but the collective weight of a history built on fear and compromise. They sought not just forgiveness, but a way to reconnect with a moral universe that had been officially denied. Across the land, in apartments and homes, a quiet restoration took place. Icons were brought out from their hiding places. They were cleaned with gentle hands, their darkened faces of wood and tempera seeming to absorb the new light. The Krasny Ugel, the beautiful corner where icons are traditionally placed, was re-established. A small candle would be lit before the images of Christ and the saints, its single flame a small but steady presence in the room. This simple act, lighting a candle without fear, was a reclamation of the home itself, turning a living space back into a sanctuary. It was a declaration that faith was not something to be confined to a church building, but something that could once again dwell among the people, in the heart of the family. There was no grand narrative of triumph, only countless small sacred moments. A teenager tracing the Cyrillic script in a newly printed Bible, an old woman weeping silently as she kissed a revered icon, a gesture she had only ever dared to make in her dreams. A man hanging a small three-barred cross from his rearview mirror, a symbol no longer of defiance, but of simple open belief. The darkness had been long, a winter of the spirit that had lasted 74 years. It had frozen rivers of tradition and buried landscapes of belief under a hard-packed snow of ideology, but seeds of faith had survived beneath the frost, tended in secret by silent gardeners. As the cold receded, they began to grow again, not with the explosive force of a revolution, but with the quiet, inexorable persistence of life, returning to a barren field. The wounds of that long winter remained. The emptied churches were a testament to all that was lost, the old priests a reminder of the cost of endurance. But the sound of bells now wove itself into the fabric of the day, a constant, gentle reminder of what had returned. The golden domes, once tarnished and neglected, were re-gilded, catching the sun and reflecting a light that seemed to emanate from within. The night had not been forgotten, but it no longer held dominion. The air was clearer now, and in the quiet that followed the fall of an empire, a different kind of sound began to fill the space it left behind. The steady, peaceful murmur of prayer rising at long last into an open sky.